Today I want to explore why repeating ourselves in a relationship is not only ineffective, but often detrimental. And let me know if you've had the same thoughts. It's a discussion about what happens with constant repetition in relationships, whether verbally or behaviorally. If you've ever found yourself repeating the same words or same behaviors in a relationship, hoping that they'd finally land and things still got worse instead of better, this video may help explain why. We say the thing again with different words or do a thing again, only better next time. What pop culture advice ignores is that relationships can actually stall in progress and reconciliation. And once that process locks in, it's almost impossible to recognize it from the inside. So today I'm going to break down that loop step by step and explain it using two well-established frameworks from psychology that you've likely already heard of: self-fulfilling prophecy and social learning theory. I'll go through how repetition unfolds, how it affects mindsets over time, and why advice that appears to be steady in the moment can actually become counterproductive. The goal here is to make the pattern visible so you can recognize it and respond to it in real time.
It's time to all choose your timeline on the roller coaster of life.
So this video is partly a follow-up to my recent discussion of advice from John Deloney, but I've also written about the psychology of repeating oneself extensively in Rules of Engagement, which I'm using as a more solid foundation for this discussion. Now, I don't want to relitigate John's advice itself, but to explain why repeated words and actions to keep a woman can become dangerous and counterproductive for men. If you've been stuck between holding your values and repeating unproductive words or behaviors at someone else's behest in a relationship, then this should sound familiar. When men hit this point in a relationship, the advice that they're usually hearing is in the form of try again, and this time, do better. And that advice feels productive in the moment, as I mentioned, because it does give actually some direction. Guys get to figure out, this is what I should be doing. It turns ambiguity into measurable pathways to success. But embedded inside that advice is an assumption that's often untrue, that the relationship can be salvaged through repeated effort. It's the often erroneous belief that try again will eventually lead to a positive outcome. Most of the men who end up in such situations are not asking how to be a perfect man. They're wondering what they need to do to finally be enough. So repeating what they're told are acceptable qualities becomes their mission. And in relationships, when a man asks how to save a marriage or how to get and keep a girlfriend, the go-to advice is to continue verbally repeating his values, because then she will finally understand, right? You just have to say it enough times. Or he's told to keep repeating behaviors with increased effort until she's appeased. And that's the point at which he hopes to achieve more than her bare minimum, and she may or may not decide to stay by that point. But I'm here to tell you that once that loop starts, it doesn't just fail to improve outcomes. It begins changing men in negative ways. So let's get to that loop. That's where human predictability comes in, because repetition is not what most people think it is. When you're in the thick of it, repetition feels like persistence. It feels loyal, responsible, hell, even masculine. It feels dependable and stable. But repetition is actually the byproduct of failed effort. Now let me say that again for those of you who are spacing out on me. Repetition is the byproduct of failed effort. You're repeating your words or escalating behaviors because it's not enough effort for her. If your initial effort had changed anything, if it had done anything for her at all, there would be no need for more repetition. If your second effort or repetition worked, there would be no third. You see where I'm going with this, right? Guys, your repetition is her strategy. And in a moment, I'm going to explain why it works in her favor while breaking you down. The point here is that men read repetition as moving forward toward resolution, whether by saying it again or doing it again, only this time better. So they keep trying to manufacture approval through repeated effort. That's where the loop that I referred to a moment ago begins. And in a moment, I'm going to explain why this loop behaves the way it does from a psychological perspective. But first, we need to understand how it actually unfolds. So let's walk through how this might play out in real life. Because it doesn't happen all at once. It happens in stages, and almost every man who ends up here can recognize himself somewhere in this sequence. We start with the first attempt to get appeasement. That's the hope stage. You're still hopeful at this point. And this is the cleanest version of your effort. After not expressing yourself well enough by her standards, you notice distance or withdraw and respond accordingly in good faith. Maybe you initiate more clear conversation or plan something intentional or show up more prepared the next time. And at this stage, effort feels grounded and productive because you genuinely believe that she'll still be responsive. If that attempt does not work, then we make another attempt, right? We start to repeat ourselves. Maybe this time she listens and nods, and maybe she continues to outright remind you that you're still doing bare minimum. And now you add more urgency to your effort. So you try again. But this time, you're processing more closely. You're checking your tone, your timing, and your wording to make sure that you actually get it right this time. You tell yourself that you just need to be more clear, more patient, and more generous. And when that doesn't work, many guys take the third attempt, which now includes more self-surveillance. And at this point, the focus quietly shifts from the relationship to you individually. This is where you start monitoring yourself. Should I say that thing again, but more thoughtfully this time? Did I push too hard? Did I not make enough effort for real? So you replay conversations and adjust behavior preemptively. Your repeated effort by this time becomes the real issue, and now you're inside your own fucking head. You're no longer trying to connect, but rather trying to not make things worse. If you stick around for the fourth attempt, that's where your own character bargaining gets real. Now the effort is no longer about the relationship at all. It's about your own self-worth. You're no longer negotiating with her, but with yourself. So you tell yourself, if I keep trying to improve this, if I keep trying to fix that, if I do more and I do what she needs, then maybe she'll really see what a great guy I am. So let me try again. Let me keep repeating. And at this stage, effort is fused to your own self-evaluation. And each failed attempt confirms a story about who you are. And that's the logical way repetition becomes self-erasing. This is the point at which men feel like they're invisible, even though actually they're doing more than ever before. So up to this point, I've been describing what this loop feels like from the inside. What makes repetition perilous is that it's not just frustrating, it's psychological. So let's move into the psychology of why continued repetition actually reshapes identity and why it keeps tightening once it starts. There's a concept in psychology that many of you have heard of called self-fulfilling prophecy, originally described by American psychologist Robert Merton. The core idea is that people's beliefs and expectations of themselves actually change their behaviors in ways that cause outcomes to become real. In simple terms, even our own thoughts and behaviors predict outcomes that we actually fulfill unintentionally, even when those outcomes are detrimental to ourselves. Applied here, it looks like this. When you repeatedly show up as if you have to earn basic attention or respect, the relationship as an organism starts treating that as true. Because behavior silently assigns roles, even if unconsciously. Each repeated statement or behavior reinforces the expectation that connection is conditional. And each repeated attempt lowers your internal authority just a little bit more. And done enough times, you stop behaving like a partner and start behaving like a pursuer, because the pattern paved your mindset. That's why trying harder often backfires. It doesn't prove effort or restore closeness, it reshapes you. Your sense of self begins orbiting around her reactions, and your emotional state rises and falls based on her responsiveness. Your worth becomes externalized, negotiated one attempt at a time. And as such, self-fulfilling prophecy explains why repeated words or effort don't just fail to fix a relationship, they actively demean you in the process. Once that shift happens, stopping becomes surprisingly difficult. And this is where the second theory matters. Social learning theory, most closely associated with psychologist Albert Bandura, explains how behavior is learned not just through outcomes, but through repeated exposure to the same pattern over time. As shown in the screen here, it starts with attention. When the relationship is disrupted, your focus narrows. You pay close attention to what you said, how you said it, what you did, and what didn't land. Your mind locks into the moment that effort failed because it assumes that the solution is still somewhere inside that moment. And then comes retention. You remember the pattern and store the idea that repeated effort is required to keep things from getting worse, even if it doesn't make things better. Meanwhile, her silence, indifference, or lack of appreciation still doesn't erase the effort. It gets encoded alongside it. And next is reproduction. This is where you repeat the behavior, you say it again, you show it again, you do it again, only this time more carefully, more earnestly, and more open-handedly. Not because it worked before, but because repetition itself now feels like the correct response. And finally, there's motivation. This is the part where most people get lost and misunderstand the most, because it can seem counterintuitive, so bear with me. In these situations, the failed, repeated effort doesn't need to succeed for the behaviors to be repeated, for you to be willing to continue to repeat yourself. It only needs to feel safer than stopping. Listen, each time effort is met with silence or disapproval, your nervous system learns that continuing preserves integrity, while stopping feels like surrender. So your repetition doesn't teach the other person to respond in the way that you want them to. It teaches you to endure non-acceptance, to keep repeating the same words or actions again and again. And over time, that endurance becomes automatic. So effort escalates not because you're obsessing to finally get it right, but because by that time, the repetitive pattern is conditioning persistence even in the absence of the outcome that you want. Listen, from the outside, I know it looks obvious, right? If it's hurting and it's not working, then why keep going? Why keep repeating? Why do people repeat effort again instead of stopping? It's because motivation does not require success. It does not require reward in the form that you want. It can be sustained by avoidance of a worse outcome. And in our example, the behavior continues because stopping feels like loss, abandonment, or personal failure. But repetition preserves identity, self-image, or emotional consistency. And the undesired outcome to continue repeating yourself is interpreted as not enough yet, rather than an outright no. So the behavior is not reinforced because it works. It's reinforced because stopping feels more psychologically risky. So let's close this loop here. Layer these two theories together and the full picture starts to become more clear. Let's contextualize this. Self-fulfilling prophecy explains how repeated effort reshapes identity and relational roles. And at the same time, social learning theory explains why effort continues even as the cost increases through repetition. And together, they close that loop. Repeated effort leads to non-response. Non-response trains endurance. Endurance reinforces a diminished role, and that role demands even more effort. I'll put this image up on the screen for you as well. And this is where things become psychologically messy, especially in advice cultures that moralize unrewarded effort. Trying harder only works when reciprocity still exists in a relationship. When she respects your efforts, increased effort can help connect or reconnect. But once she has detached, continued repetition of effort stops being relational and starts being performative. And as guys, we are particularly vulnerable here because we are wired such that more effort leads to improved outcomes. So we train more and we get stronger. We study more and we get better grades. We make more widgets and we earn more money. As I mentioned in my critique of John Deloney a couple of weeks ago, that model works in school, work, fitness, and most careers. But it fails when another human being has agency over the outcome. Each failed repetition becomes evidence in her mind that something is wrong with you. And honestly, it becomes evidence to yourself as well. Because repetition is framed as virtue and repeated failure gets internalized. In a nutshell, the ultimate perception is that if it didn't work, you didn't try hard enough. So go do it again. A positive shift in mindset does not begin with deciding whether or not you should keep trying or repeating yourself. It begins by recognizing what repetition really means. A shifting mindset is asking yourself, why am I still acting like effort will change an answer that's already been given? Despite what women will tell you, none of this is about quitting like a little bitch or not having the balls to stay with somebody that would ask you to keep repeating your boundaries or to keep spending more to keep her around. It's about regaining internal authority. And once you understand that, the loop loses its power. I understand that most men who end up in this loop did not repeat themselves because they're weak. They did it because they were hopeful, committed, and conditioned to believe that repeated effort will fix things. They believe that continuing to do more and more will finally get them the respect that they want and deserve. But clarity is what closes that loop. So let me know your thoughts and how this has played out for you. Drop a comment for other guys to learn from, and I'll see you soon.